She sat across from me in a chair that had held her weight for 30 years, a faded floral print, worn smooth on the armrests. Her hands shook when she lifted her tea. Her voice cracked between sentences. She was 98 years old, and when I asked her what scared her about getting old, she looked at me like I'd missed the point entirely. "Growing old?" she said. "That's not what people fear. Not really." She paused, took a breath, and what she said next hasn't left me. I've tried to move on from it. I can't. Most of us believe we're afraid of aging. The wrinkles, the gray hair, the slowing down. We look at old age the way we look at a storm on the horizon, something to outrun, something to delay. But what if we've been wrong? What if the thing that terrifies us about getting old has almost nothing to do with getting old at all? A survey once found that 87% of Americans admit they fear aging. 87. That's almost everyone. And when researchers asked what exactly they were afraid of, the answer seemed obvious at first. Physical decline, memory loss, chronic illness. But the deeper they dug, the more those answers began to change. Because underneath the fear of a failing body was something else, something quieter, something most people couldn't even put into words until it was almost too late. A woman named Bronnie Ware spent years working in palliative care in Australia. She sat with people in the final weeks of their lives. She held their hands. She listened. And she started to notice something. The dying weren't talking about their bodies. They weren't mourning their youth. They weren't wishing for more time at the gym or one more look in the mirror. They were mourning something else entirely. The number one regret she heard over and over, from bed after bed, was this: "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. Not the life others expected of me. Not health, not money, not appearance, courage, authenticity, the life they never let themselves live. And the second most common regret, I wish I hadn't worked so hard." Every single man she nursed said it. They had missed their children's youth. They had missed their partners. They had traded presents for productivity and never got the refund. Growing old didn't break these people. What broke them was looking back and realizing they had spent their years on the wrong things. There's a study that began in 1938 at Harvard University. Researchers started following 268 young men sophomores at the time to understand what makes a life go well, what makes people healthy, what makes people happy. That study is still running. It's one of the longest studies of adult life ever conducted. And after nearly 9 decades of data, medical records, interviews, brain scans, questionnaires, the conclusion is striking in its simplicity. It wasn't cholesterol levels at age 50 that predicted who'd be healthy at 80. It wasn't career success. It wasn't genetics or wealth or fame. It was relationships. The people who were most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were the healthiest physically and mentally at age 80. And those who were isolated, who had let their connections fade, who were alone not by choice, but by neglect, they deteriorated faster. Their brains declined sooner. Their bodies gave out earlier. As the studies director, Robert Waldinger, put it plainly, loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. I think about my own grandfather when I hear that line. He was a quiet man, proud, never asked anyone for anything. After my grandmother passed, he kept the house exactly as she'd left it, her reading glasses still on the nightstand, her coat still on the hook by the door. He said he was fine. He always said he was fine. He wasn't fine. He just didn't have the words for what he'd lost, or anyone left to say them to. And yet we live in a world that practically trains us to be lonely. We celebrate independence. We reward hustle. We tell people to grind now and live later. We scroll through other people's lives instead of building our own. And then one day we look up from our desks, our phones, our carefully constructed routines and realize the chair across from us is empty. The World Health Organization estimates that roughly 1 in 4 adults over 65 is socially isolated. In the United States, an AARP national survey found that about 40% of older adults report feeling lonely. Not just alone, lonely. There's a difference. You can be alone and at peace. But loneliness is something else. Loneliness is the gap between the connection you need and the connection you have. And that gap doesn't just show up in old age. It starts decades earlier. It starts with the friendships you let slide, the phone calls you didn't return, the family dinners you skipped because you were busy. It starts with the slow, almost invisible withdrawal from the people who mattered most. By the time you notice it, you're 70, and the room is very, very quiet. Researchers at the University of Bath conducted a project where they sat down with 80 older people for in-depth conversations over 130 hours of listening. What they found goes deeper than statistics. A man named Douglas, 86, had lost his wife 5 years earlier. He told the researchers he still hadn't recovered. "They say it gets better," he said. "It never gets better." He had no one to confide in, no close friend, no outlet. He said that in his family, people never talked about their feelings. It was different growing up then. A woman named Alice was 93. She had outlived her husband, her partner, her siblings, her friends, and most recently, her only son. She said quietly, "You know, underneath it all, I wouldn't mind leaving this world. Everyone has died, and I think I'm lonely." That sentence should stop you. Not because it's sad, but because it reveals what actually waits at the end of a life where connection was never prioritized. Not death, something worse than death. The feeling of being the last one standing in an empty room. There's a gerontologist named Karl Pillemer at Cornell University who spent 5 years interviewing more than 1,000 Americans between the ages of 70 and 100. He wanted to know what practical wisdom they'd earned from living that long. And when he compiled their answers, one thing stood out above all else. Not a single person, not one out of more than 1,000, said you should spend your life chasing money. Not one said success was measured by what you accumulated. Not one said to pick your career based on salary. What they said was, spend your time with the people who matter. Don't let your children grow up in your absence. Don't save all your living for retirement. Don't assume the people you love know you love them. Say it, show it, now, while the chairs around your table are still full. So if it's not growing old that people truly fear, what is it? The first fear is the one no one talks about. It's irrelevance. It's becoming invisible. Research has shown that as people age, many begin to feel as though the world has moved on without them. They're no longer asked for their opinion, no longer invited, no longer seen. 70% of women in one study said they felt they became invisible after a certain age. And it's not vanity, it's primal. Human beings are wired for belonging. When that belonging disappears, when you feel like the world no longer needs you, no longer notices you, something inside begins to shut down. The second fear cuts deeper. It's regret. Not the small kind. Not, I wish I'd taken that vacation. The kind that sits in your chest at 3 a.m. The kind Bronnie Ware heard in those hospital rooms. I wish I had been braver. I wish I had told the truth. I wish I hadn't let fear make my decisions. The gerontologist Malcolm Johnson calls it biographical pain. The psychological suffering that comes from reliving wrong choices, broken promises, unresolved wounds. Living to be old, he wrote, is still considered a great benefit, but dying slowly, with too much time to reflect and no prospect of redressing harms, has few redeeming features. The third fear is the quietest and the most devastating. It's disconnection. The feeling that you are fundamentally separated from the world. Researchers call it existential loneliness, a sense that the gap between yourself and everyone else has become impossible to cross. Not because no one is around, but because the threads that once tied you to life have, one by one, been cut. But here's what makes this more than just a sad story. Because the people who studied this, the researchers, the nurses, the gerontologists, they didn't stop at the diagnosis. They also found the ones who got it right. The Harvard study didn't just track decline, it tracked flourishing. And the people who thrived into their 80s and 90s had something in common. They had invested in their relationships the way most people invest in their careers. Deliberately, consistently, even when it was inconvenient. Some of the octogenarian couples bickered constantly. They argued about everything. But when the researchers looked closer, those couples shared something essential. They trusted each other. They knew deeply, without question, that the other person would be there when it counted. And that trust was enough. Not perfection, not romance, trust. Karl Pillemer's elders said the same thing in a different way. Happiness, they insisted, is a choice, not a destination. Not something that arrives when circumstances align. A daily, deliberate choice to be present, to be grateful, to show up for the people in your life, not tomorrow, not when things settle down, but now. One woman in her 90s told him, "Young man, you will learn, I hope, that happiness is what you make it, where you are. It's my responsibility to be as happy as I can, right here, today." The 98-year-old woman I mentioned at the beginning didn't give me a list of tips. She didn't quote a study. She didn't lecture. She just looked at me with those steady, clear eyes and said something I haven't been able to forget. People think the worst part of getting old is what you lose, your strength, your looks, your independence, but that's not it. The worst part is realizing you had everything and you were too busy, too scared, or too proud to hold on to it. She smoothed the front of her cardigan with trembling fingers, the way someone does when they're deciding whether to say the last thing. "And the funny thing is," she said, "I still catch myself doing it, even now." She let the silence sit between us. Then she said, "The body will do what the body does. You can't stop that. But the soul only gets old when it stops reaching for other people." Here's the truth no one tells you about aging. The fear isn't about wrinkles. It isn't about forgetting names. It isn't about needing help up the stairs. The fear is about arriving at the end and discovering you were never truly present for the middle. Every day you are alive, you are choosing. You're choosing what to give your attention to, who to give your time to, what kind of life to build before the body begins to slow and the rooms begin to empty. The 98-year-old already knows this. The question is whether you'll know it too before it's your turn to sit in that chair with shaking hands and a cup of tea, wishing someone had told you sooner. Someone just did.